Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Tonight's story begins with a question that once terrified an entire southern county. What happens when the daughter of a hangman learns every secret of execution and waits patiently for the moment to use it? Because on March 3rd, 1857, a young woman named Harriet Bell did something no one believed possible. 5 white men who once forced her father to hang innocent people were found dead on the same gallows they had used to terrorize others, and the person who built those gallows was Harriet herself. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time where you are. If you have not yet subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like the video. Stories like this reveal the hidden sides of history that rarely appear in textbooks. Now stay with us until the end, because Harriet Bell's story is one of the most calculated acts of revenge ever whispered about during the era of slavery. The year was 1855, in a small county along the border of Kentucky and Virginia, where justice often looked very different depending on who held power. In that county lived a man named Samuel Bell, an enslaved carpenter who possessed a skill that made white authorities uneasy. Samuel understood the precise mechanics of wood structures better than anyone in the region. He built barns that could withstand storms, bridges that crossed dangerous creeks, and occasionally something far darker: gallows. In counties where public executions were common, someone had to construct the hanging platforms. Samuel Bell was forced into that role. The sheriff believed an enslaved carpenter could build the structure without questioning the purpose. For years, Samuel built gallows he prayed would never be used. But the law had no interest in his prayers. Samuel had one child, his daughter, Harriet Bell. Harriet grew up watching her father shape heavy beams of oak into structures designed for death. She was not supposed to understand the work, but Harriet had a mind that noticed details others ignored. She watched how her father measured rope length. She watched how he tested the trapdoor weight. She listened quietly whenever the sheriff discussed the physics of hanging, because execution was not random. It was mathematical. The rope length had to match a man's weight. Too short, and the prisoner would suffocate slowly. Too long, and the neck could tear violently. A perfect drop required careful calculation. Harriet learned all of it without ever being formally taught. But the moment that changed everything came in the winter of 1856. That year, Samuel Bell's younger brother Isaac was accused of stealing a horse from a local plantation owner. Isaac insisted he was innocent. Several people in the quarters even confirmed he had been working in the fields the night the horse disappeared. But accusations from white landowners carried more weight than truth. Isaac was arrested. The sheriff ordered a public execution. And because Samuel Bell was the county's forced carpenter, he was ordered to build the gallows himself. That alone was cruel enough. But the sheriff added something worse. Samuel would also be the one to pull the lever. The execution took place on a cold morning in front of a crowd gathered near the courthouse square. Harriet stood among the enslaved workers, forced to watch. Her father's hands shook as he stood beside the trapdoor. Isaac looked at him calmly. "Don't blame yourself," Isaac said quietly. But Samuel could barely breathe. When the sheriff gave the signal, Samuel pulled the lever. Isaac fell through the trapdoor. The rope snapped tight, and in that moment, Harriet Bell watched something inside her father break forever. That night, Samuel sat in silence outside their cabin. Harriet sat beside him. "They made you do it," she said. Samuel shook his head slowly. I still did it. From that night forward, Samuel continued building gallows whenever the county demanded it, but Harriet began watching his work more carefully than ever before. Not with fear, with calculation. She asked questions about rope length, about beam strength, about drop measurements. Samuel thought she simply wanted to understand carpentry. For 18 months, Harriet Bell studied every detail of execution mechanics. She learned how weight affected rope tension. She memorized the precise distance needed to snap a neck instantly. She practiced tying knots strong enough to hold a falling body. The sheriff even allowed her to assist occasionally, believing she was simply learning her father's trade. They thought they were training a carpenter. They were wrong. Harriet had begun designing something in her mind, because the men responsible for her uncle's death were the same men who regularly gathered at the county's small execution yard. The sheriff, 2 plantation overseers, and 2 wealthy landowners who helped enforce local punishment. 5 men, and Harriet knew exactly how gallows worked. By early 1857, Harriet quietly constructed a new hanging structure in the woods, several miles outside the town. She told curious passers-by that she was practicing carpentry skills. No one questioned her. A young enslaved woman building wooden frames did not attract much suspicion. But Harriet's structure was different. It had 5 ropes and 5 trapdoors, each rope measured carefully. Each beam reinforced for equal weight distribution. The design allowed all 5 mechanisms to release at the same moment. She was building something even the sheriff had never attempted. A simultaneous execution platform. On the night of March 3rd, 1857, Harriet put the final piece of her plan into motion. The sheriff and his associates had spent the evening drinking heavily at a nearby tavern. Harriet knew their routines well. She also knew the road they used to return to town. Shortly after midnight, the 5 men were ambushed near the wooded clearing where Harriet had built the gallows. Exactly how she subdued them remains unclear. Some later accounts suggested she used deception. Others claimed she had help from people in the quarters who also wanted revenge. What is certain is that by early morning, the 5 men stood on the platform Harriet had built, each man's neck inside a rope, each rope calculated to match their body weight. Harriet stepped onto the platform. The sheriff recognized her immediately. "You don't know what you're doing," he shouted. Harriet answered calmly, "Yes, I do." Because for 18 months, she had studied the mathematics of execution. She checked each knot carefully. Then she stepped to the center lever that controlled the 5 trapdoors, the same mechanism her father had once been forced to pull. At dawn, Harriet Bell pulled the lever. All 5 trapdoors dropped at once. 5 perfect executions. No struggle. No suffocation. Just the precise mathematics she had learned watching her father's. By the time townspeople discovered the bodies later that morning, Harriet Bell was already gone. Some said she fled north that same night with help from local abolitionists. Others believed she followed hidden routes used by the Underground Railroad. What is known is that Harriet Bell was never captured, and her name slowly turned into something between history and legend, because the daughter of a hangman had used the very techniques slavery forced her family to learn, not to continue the system, but to destroy 5 of the men who enforced it. And that is why even today, whispers about the hangman's daughter still circulate in the darker corners of American history. A story about patience, about calculation, and about revenge executed with the same precision slavery once demanded. After the bodies were discovered at sunrise on March 4th, 1857, the entire county descended into panic. 5 powerful white men hanging from the same gallows was something no one had ever seen before. Crowds gathered near the wooded clearing as deputies cut the bodies down one by one. The sheriff, 2 overseers, and 2 landowners had all died instantly. The drop had been calculated with terrifying precision. Whoever built that gallows understood execution mechanics better than most trained hangmen. And that realization frightened the town even more, because only one person in the county knew that craft well enough to do it: Samuel Bell. Deputies rode straight to the Bell cabin that morning. Samuel was sitting outside, staring at the ground as if he had not slept. When the men dragged him to his feet and accused him of building the gallows, Samuel shook his head slowly. "I didn't build it," he said. "Then who did?" one of the deputies demanded. Samuel looked toward the empty road, where his daughter should have been walking back from the well. For a moment, he said nothing, but inside, he already understood. Harriet was gone, and the men hanging from those ropes had died exactly the way his brother had died the year before. The deputies searched the cabin, the fields, and every nearby road, but Harriet Bell had already vanished. Some witnesses later claimed they saw a young woman traveling north before sunrise that morning. Others said she was escorted through the woods by people connected to the Underground Railroad, a network that quietly moved escaped enslaved people toward freedom. What made the investigation even stranger was the gallows itself. When local carpenters examined the structure, they realized something remarkable. The design was flawless. Each rope had been measured precisely for the weight of the man it held. The trapdoors dropped at exactly the same moment. The beam joints were reinforced with techniques rarely used in execution platforms. Whoever built it had not simply guessed. They had studied. The county judge said something that day that many people never forgot. "This was not rage," he said. "This was engineering." And that truth made the story even more unsettling, because Harriet Bell had spent 18 months quietly learning those techniques, while the very men she would eventually kill believed she was simply assisting her father. Back on the plantation, Samuel Bell was questioned repeatedly. The deputies demanded to know if he had helped plan the revenge. Samuel gave the same answer every time: "My daughter learned by watching." The deputies could never prove he had helped her. And deep down, they suspected something else. Samuel Bell had never shown the kind of cold precision required to plan 5 simultaneous executions, but Harriet had. For weeks, the county organized search parties, hoping to capture her before she reached northern states. Posters describing a dangerous fugitive woman named Harriet Bell appeared in nearby towns. None of the search parties found her. The Underground Railroad routes through Kentucky, Ohio, and Pennsylvania were already well established by the late 1850s. Abolitionist families and secret safe houses helped escaped slaves move from one hiding place to another under the cover of darkness. Some historians later suggested Harriet Bell followed one of those routes toward Ohio, where many freedom seekers crossed the border into free territory. Others believed she traveled even farther north into Canada, where American slave laws held no authority. Wherever Harriet Bell ended up, the county never saw her again. But her story refused to disappear. In the months after the executions, something unusual began happening among the enslaved communities across several nearby counties. People started whispering about the hangman's daughter. They spoke about the young woman who had studied the mathematics of death, the daughter who turned the skills slavery forced upon her family into a weapon against the men who enforced the system. The story traveled quietly through plantations and farm roads, not loudly, not openly, but steadily, because Harriet's revenge represented something larger than the deaths of 5 men. It showed that knowledge could become power, and that patience could become justice. Even Samuel Bell eventually heard the whispers spreading across the region. One evening, an elderly man from another plantation approached him near the road. "They say your daughter built that gallows herself," the man said. Samuel looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. "Yes," he replied. The old man nodded slowly. "They say she measured every rope perfectly." Samuel closed his eyes for a moment. "That's what I taught her." The man studied him carefully. "You regret it?" Samuel opened his eyes again. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he answered quietly, "No," because Samuel Bell understood something few others did. Harriet had not just learned how to build gallows. She had learned the science of control the system used to maintain fear. And then she had taken that knowledge back. Years later, after the Civil War ended slavery across the United States, historians occasionally stumbled across references to the strange execution that occurred in 1857. Most official records described it simply as an act of murder by an escaped slave woman. But the deeper story survived in oral history, passed quietly through families who remembered the name Harriet Bell, the woman who waited 18 months, the woman who built the gallows herself, the woman who executed the men who once forced her father to hang his own brother, and then disappeared into freedom before the system that created her revenge could ever capture her. That is why the legend of the hangman's daughter still echoes in forgotten corners of American history. A story not just about revenge, but about patience, calculation, and a young woman who turned the brutal lessons of slavery into the most precise act of justice her oppressors could never have imagined. In the years after 1857, the story of Harriet Bell did not disappear. It changed shape. Some people called her a murderer. Others called her a ghost, who walked out of slavery and vanished into the North. But among enslaved communities across Kentucky, Virginia, and Ohio, the story carried a different meaning. They called her the hangman's daughter. And the story was told quietly at night, when the overseers were asleep and the fields were silent. Older men would lean close to the fire and say, "She learned their system better than they knew it themselves." Women would whisper about the patience it must have taken to wait 18 months without revealing a single piece of the plan, because that was the most frightening part for the authorities. Harriet Bell had not acted out of sudden anger. She had acted with calculation. The county that lost those 5 men never truly recovered from the shock. Local newspapers wrote about the gallows murders, but the articles never explained how a young enslaved woman had managed to build such a precise execution structure without anyone noticing. The answer was simple. No one had been looking. In the slave system, people like Harriet were expected to be invisible. Their intelligence was ignored, their observations dismissed. Harriet used that invisibility as cover. Meanwhile, somewhere far to the north, a young woman traveling under different names slowly moved through the secret pathways of the Underground Railroad. Abolitionist families helped her cross rivers and farmland under the protection of darkness. Safe houses opened their doors quietly, asking few questions. One account from an abolitionist journal in Ohio, years later, described a woman who arrived late one winter night, wearing worn boots and carrying only a small wooden toolkit. The woman never gave her full name, but she knew carpentry, and she refused to speak about the South. According to that account, the woman eventually continued north toward Michigan, where many freedom seekers crossed into Canada. Whether that woman was Harriet Bell remains impossible to prove, but the timing matched, and the details were too close to ignore. Back in the South, Samuel Bell lived quietly for several more years. After the execution incident, the county authorities never fully trusted him again, but they also lacked proof that he had helped his daughter. So Samuel continued working as a carpenter. He built barns. He repaired wagons. And occasionally, when the county demanded it, he still built gallows. But something had changed. One day, a young deputy watched Samuel carefully measuring a beam for another execution platform. "You're very precise," the deputy said. Samuel nodded. "You have to be." "Why?" Samuel paused before answering. "Because if the rope is wrong, the man dies slowly." The deputy frowned. "And that bothers you?" Samuel looked at the beam for a long moment. "Yes." The deputy studied him suspiciously. "Your daughter didn't seem to mind." Samuel slowly placed the measuring tool down. "My daughter understood something you don't." "What's that?" "That the rope itself wasn't the crime." The deputy crossed his arms. "Then what was?" Samuel looked him directly in the eye. "The people deciding who stood on the platform." The deputy had no answer for that. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, the world Harriet Bell had grown up in no longer existed. Slavery was abolished. The gallows built to enforce slave law were dismantled in many counties. The system that had forced Samuel Bell to execute innocent men was collapsing across the South. But Harriet Bell's story remained, not in official records, but in memory. Older generations passed it down carefully, a reminder that knowledge, patience, and timing could challenge even the most brutal systems of power. Some said Harriet Bell lived the rest of her life somewhere in Canada under a new name. Others believed she stayed hidden in northern states, working quietly as a carpenter, where no one knew her past. The truth may never be fully known, but one fact has never been disputed. On March 3rd, 1857, 5 men who believed they controlled the law stood on a gallows designed by the daughter of the man they had once forced into becoming their executioner. And when the trapdoors fell, Harriet Bell proved something that the slave system never wanted people to understand. The most dangerous person in any system of oppression is not always the strongest. It is the one who studies the system long enough to learn exactly how to break it. That is why even today, historians still whisper about the hangman's daughter. The woman who turned the science of execution into the most calculated revenge in the history of slavery. As the years passed, and the United States moved further away from the era of slavery, Harriet Bell's story became something that existed between history and legend. Official court records mentioned the deaths of the 5 men in 1857, but the reports rarely described the deeper story. To the authorities of that time, Harriet Bell was simply recorded as a fugitive responsible for multiple murders. But history is rarely written only in official documents. Among black communities across Kentucky, Ohio, and later in parts of Canada, the story continued traveling quietly through generations. Grandparents told it to grandchildren during long evenings when people spoke about the past, not loudly, not publicly, but carefully. They spoke about patience. about intelligence, and about the danger of underestimating someone who is forced to live inside a system long enough to understand it. In those stories, Harriet Bell was never described as reckless. She was described as methodical. A young woman who had watched the machinery of injustice so closely that she eventually knew how every piece of it worked, even the mathematics of death. Because what frightened the authorities most about Harriet's revenge was not simply that she carried it out. It was how precisely she did it. Execution during the 19th century required knowledge most people never studied. Rope strength, weight distribution, drop distance, beam tension. A mistake in any of those calculations could lead to a slow and painful death rather than an instant one. But the 5 men who died that morning experienced what the executioners called a perfect drop, which meant Harriet Bell had mastered the exact science her father had been forced to practice for years. That detail haunted the county for decades. Local historians later discovered something interesting when studying the records from that time. After the execution incident, several nearby counties quietly stopped forcing enslaved carpenters to assist with gallows construction. No one wanted to train another Harriet Bell. But the most powerful part of her story had little to do with violence. It had to do with patience. For 18 months, Harriet learned without revealing her intentions. She watched men who believed they were teaching her a trade. She memorized measurements. She practiced knots. She studied the mechanics of trapdoors and beams. And during all that time, the people around her believed she was harmless. That miscalculation cost them everything. One elderly man who had once been enslaved in the region was interviewed in the 1880s about the story. When asked what Harriet Bell represented to people at the time, he gave a simple answer. She represented the moment when someone stopped being afraid. The interviewer asked another question. Did people celebrate what she did? The old man thought about that carefully before responding. No. Why not? Because revenge was not the important part. Then what was? The fact that she proved something. What did she prove? That even inside slavery, the mind could remain free. That idea carried enormous weight in communities that had lived through generations of oppression. Harriet Bell had shown that knowledge could become power, that patience could become resistance, and that the systems built to control people could sometimes teach those same people exactly how to defeat them. To this day, historians still debate how much of the Harriet Bell story can be verified through official records and how much survives only through oral history. But certain facts remain undeniable. 5 men died on a gallows on March 3rd, 1857. The structure was engineered with extraordinary precision, and the only person known to possess the knowledge required to build it disappeared the same night. Whether Harriet Bell lived the rest of her life in quiet freedom somewhere far from the South may never be fully known, but the legend of the hangman's daughter continues to survive. Not because of the revenge itself, but because of the lesson hidden inside it, a lesson about observation, about patience, and about the power of knowledge in a world that tried desperately to keep certain people from ever gaining it. If this story fascinated you, make sure you subscribe to Shadows of Black History, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like Harriet Bell's remind us that history is not only shaped by armies and governments. Sometimes it is shaped by one person who quietly studies the system around them long enough to understand exactly how it works, and then chooses the perfect moment to change it forever. Even after the Civil War ended and slavery was officially abolished in 1865, story of Harriet Bell refused to fade. In many places across the South, people were trying to rebuild their lives after years of violence and destruction. Laws were changing, governments were shifting, and communities were trying to understand what freedom would actually look like. But some stories from the slavery era continued to circulate quietly, especially those that carried powerful lessons. Harriet Bell's story was one of them. Among formerly enslaved communities, the story was not told as a tale of cruelty or bloodshed. Instead, it was told as an example of intelligence and patience. Older generations would explain how Harriet had spent 18 months learning the very system that had destroyed her family. She did not act immediately. She did not reveal her anger. She observed. She studied. And she waited. Those details mattered because they challenged the common narrative that enslaved people were powerless or unaware. Harriet's story showed something very different. It showed awareness. It showed strategy. And it showed that knowledge could become one of the most powerful forms of resistance. In some parts of Ohio and Michigan, where many freedom seekers had settled after escaping the South, stories circulated about a quiet woman who worked as a carpenter during the late 1860s and early 1870s. According to a few scattered accounts, this woman rarely spoke about her past, but was known for building strong wooden structures with remarkable precision. One man who claimed to know her described something unusual about her work. "She measured everything twice," he said. "Why?" someone asked. He replied simply, "She didn't believe in mistakes." Whether that woman was truly Harriet Bell cannot be proven. The Underground Railroad often helped escapees adopt new names and identities once they reached safer territories. Many people who escaped slavery deliberately erased their past to avoid capture or retaliation. If Harriet Bell survived and reached freedom, she may have lived the rest of her life quietly under another name. But the legacy she left behind remained. Historians studying slavery resistance movements later noticed something important. Acts of resistance during slavery were not always open revolts or violent uprisings. Sometimes resistance looked like small, careful acts of preparation. Learning to read secretly, memorizing routes to the north, studying the systems used to control enslaved people. Harriet Bell's story fits into that larger pattern of resistance. She used the knowledge forced upon her family and turned it into a weapon against the men who abused that system. In doing so, she created one of the most unusual stories from the slavery era. The story of a young woman who learned the science of execution not to serve the system, but to challenge it. Today, historians continue debating the details surrounding Harriet Bell's life. Records from the mid-19th century were often incomplete, especially when they involved enslaved people. But the oral histories passed down through generations have preserved the core elements of the story. A father forced to build gallows. A brother executed for a crime he did not commit. A daughter who studied every detail of the system responsible. And a night in 1857, when 5 powerful men faced the very mechanism they had once used to enforce fear. Stories like Harriet Bell's remind us that history is not always found in official documents. Sometimes it survives in whispered memories, family stories, and traditions passed from one generation to the next. And sometimes those stories reveal truths that official records tried to ignore. That enslaved people were not simply victims of history. They were observers, thinkers, strategists, and in rare moments like Harriet Bell's story, they were also architects of their own form of justice. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story opened your eyes to a different side of history, Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time there right now. Because stories like this deserve to travel far beyond the places where they first began. Before we end tonight's story on Shadows of Black History, there is one final part of the legend that many historians still discuss when Harriet Bell's name appears in old records and oral histories. Years after the executions in 1857, long after the Civil War had ended and slavery had officially been abolished, a traveling journalist passed through parts of Ohio, collecting stories from formerly enslaved families who had escaped through the Underground Railroad. During one of those interviews, an elderly woman mentioned a quiet carpenter who had lived in the area years earlier. According to the woman, the carpenter rarely spoke about the South. She worked carefully, measured everything precisely, and avoided large gatherings, but there was one detail that made people remember her. She refused to ever build gallows. The journalist asked why. The elderly woman said the carpenter once answered that question with a single sentence: "I have already built enough of those for one lifetime." The journalist never confirmed the woman's identity, but the story appeared briefly in a regional paper decades later. Many historians believe that reference may have been one of the last surviving clues about Harriet Bell's life after her escape. Whether it truly referred to her may never be proven, but the story itself carries meaning. Because Harriet Bell represents something larger than one act of revenge. Her story reflects a truth about the history of slavery that is often overlooked. Enslaved people were constantly observing the systems that controlled them. They studied the rules, the punishments, the structures of power. And sometimes, when the opportunity appeared, they used that knowledge in ways their oppressors never expected. Harriet's story reminds us that resistance did not always happen in large rebellions or famous revolts. Sometimes it happened quietly, through patience, through observation, through preparation, and sometimes through a single moment when someone decided the system that had controlled their life would no longer decide their future. That is why stories like The Hangman's Daughter continue to circulate today. They challenge the simplified versions of history that often ignore the intelligence, strategy, and resilience of enslaved people. Even if parts of Harriet Bell's story remain surrounded by legend, the deeper truth behind it remains powerful. Knowledge is dangerous to systems built on control. And the most powerful form of resistance is often the ability to understand a system better than the people who believe they control it. If you enjoyed this story, remember to subscribe to Shadows of Black History, like the video, and share it with someone who loves powerful historical stories. Also tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time there right now. Because every time these stories are told, another piece of forgotten history continues to live. Even after all the retellings, the debates, and the passing of generations, one question still lingers whenever historians or storytellers mention Harriet Bell. What kind of mind does it take to wait 18 months for revenge? Most acts of vengeance in history happen quickly, driven by anger or sudden opportunity. But Harriet's story stands apart because it was built on patience. She did not act when her uncle died. She did not act when her father was forced to pull the lever. Instead, she watched. She listened. She learned the very system that had destroyed her family. That patience is what continues to fascinate historians today. The mechanics of execution in the 19th century were not simple. The so-called perfect drop required knowledge of physics that most people never studied. Weight had to be calculated. Rope length had to be measured carefully. Even the strength of the beam mattered. One mistake could lead to hours of suffering rather than a quick death. Yet the 5 men who died that morning experienced a flawless execution. That detail alone has kept the story alive for more than a century and a half, because whoever built that gallows understood the science of death better than the men who had used it for years. And that knowledge had come from watching, from studying, from being underestimated. In many ways, Harriet Bell's story represents one of the deepest ironies of slavery itself. The system depended on the belief that enslaved people were incapable of complex thought or strategic planning. But history repeatedly proves the opposite. Enslaved men and women created secret communication networks, learned to read in hidden schools, memorized escape routes through forests and rivers, and built entire underground systems of resistance. Harriet Bell's story fits into that long tradition of intelligence and resilience. She took a brutal skill forced upon her family and transformed it into a moment that terrified the very people who believed they controlled her life. That is why the legend of the hangman's daughter continues to circulate even today, not just as a story of revenge, but as a reminder that systems built on oppression often underestimate the people living inside them, and sometimes that underestimation becomes their greatest weakness. Thank you for spending this time with Shadows of Black History. If this story captured your attention, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who enjoys powerful stories from the hidden corners of history. And before you go, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time where you are right now. Because the story of Harriet Bell, the hangman's daughter, deserves to travel far beyond the place where it first began. Before we close tonight's story on Shadows of Black History, there is one last thought that historians often return to when discussing Harriet Bell. History is full of revolts, rebellions, and dramatic uprisings. Names like Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and Harriet Tubman appear in textbooks because their actions shaped large movements. But history is also filled with quieter moments of resistance that rarely make it into official records. Moments where one person studied the system around them long enough to understand its weaknesses. Harriet Bell's story sits in that space. Whether every detail of the legend can be proven or not, the core idea behind it reflects a truth that historians widely recognize today. Enslaved people were never passive observers of the world around them. They analyzed the rules that controlled their lives. They watched the patterns of power. They studied the tools used to enforce fear. And sometimes, they turned those tools back against the system itself. That is why the legend of the hangman's daughter continues to be told more than 160 years later. It reminds us that knowledge can become a weapon, that patience can become resistance, and that even in the harshest systems of control, the human mind remains capable of learning, adapting, and waiting for the right moment. Somewhere in the long chain of history, a young woman named Harriet Bell learned the mathematics of execution, not because she wanted to become an executioner, but because the system forced that knowledge into her life. What she did with that knowledge afterward became the story we remember today. If stories like this interest you, make sure you stay with Shadows of Black History. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who enjoys learning about the hidden and complex parts of history. And before you leave, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time there right now, because the stories of the past deserve to travel far beyond the places where they first happened. And every time they are told, another piece of forgotten history finds its voice again.